Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive. Today, we're going to unpack something pretty fascinating, the world of folklore, but with a twist. We're not just going to rehash those classic tales. We're going to look them through the lens of psychoanalytic theory, like those hidden meanings and how these stories connect to the human psyche.
Yeah, it's really interesting is that we're not just talking about fairy tales, but like the whole spectrum of folklore, from songs and proverbs to myths and rituals. It's that amazing tapestry of cultural expression that gets passed down through generations.
It's true. Okay, so psychoanalysis, it's kind of controversial, right? Like, are we reading too much into these stories? Is that even possible?
Oh, there's always that debate for sure.
Yeah.
But the beauty of psychoanalysis, I think, is that it offers a potential way to understand those underlying motivations, the anxieties and desires that are woven into these stories. It's about exploring both the individual and collective levels of meaning.
I see what you mean. Now, to really appreciate this connection between psychoanalysis and folklore, we need to rewind the clock back to the 19th century. What was the folklore scene like back then?
Well, think national pride and like epic heroes. Early folklore scholars were all about tracing the origins of cultures,
Mhm.
and finding those pure roots of national identity.
It sounds almost romantic, like a quest for a cultural holy grail. But didn't this focus on national identity take a darker turn in the 20th century with things like, I don't know, the World Wars?
Unfortunately, yeah. The rise of aggressive nationalism, like in Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, saw folklore being manipulated for political agendas, which is pretty scary when you think about it. It's a stark reminder that even something as seemingly innocent as folklore can be used for harmful purposes.
That's a chilling thought. So how did psychoanalysis enter this picture? Where does it fit in?
Right at the turn of the 20th century, Sigmund Freud was making waves with his groundbreaking ideas about the human mind, and he viewed myths and folklore as expressions of our collective unconscious, that deep well of shared desires, fears, and anxieties that he believed connected all of humanity.
Okay, now this is where things get really interesting. Freud believed everything in these stories. Even the most seemingly mundane details could be symbolic, often when ties to sexuality.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
Things like sticks representing the phallus or caves symbolizing female genitalia, even actions like riding or flying being interpreted as expressions of sexual gratification. Oh, and who could forget the infamous interpretation of hair falling out as symbolizing castration?
Yeah.
Yeah, some of these interpretations were definitely shocking, especially back then.
I can only imagine. So let's talk about Oedipus. He seems to be the go-to example when applying Freudian analysis to myths.
Oh yeah, rightfully so. For those who might need a refresher, the Oedipus myth is about a man who unknowingly kills his father and marries his mother, a true Greek tragedy. But Freud saw it as more than just a tragic tale. He saw it as a representation of those, deepest, most taboo desires, the desire to eliminate the father figure and possess the mother figure. Yeah, these interpretations were truly revolutionary, even scandalous at the time.
It makes you wonder if Freud was really onto something or if he's just seeing what he wanted to see. But didn't some of Freud's followers, take his ideas and run with them?
Oh, they did. For example, Ernest Jones, a prominent psychoanalyst, was fascinated by those creatures that go bump in the night, like nightmares, monsters, witches, vampires.
Yeah.
He saw them as externalizations of our anxieties and repressed desires, like playing out those fears and forbidden urges in symbolic form.
So it's like our inner demons are putting on a shadow puppet show, and the monsters are the stars of the show.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's a fantastic way to put it. And his interpretations were often closely tied to the social and cultural norms of the time. Take the figure of the witch, for example. Jones viewed her as representing this complex mix of anxieties, women's fear and anger towards their mothers, anxieties surrounding their own sexuality, and even the perceived threat they posed to those patriarchal power structures.
So the witch wasn't just a scary figure in a fairy tale, but a symbol of all these deeper anxieties and tensions bubbling beneath the surface of society. That's pretty deep.
Exactly. And those anxieties played out in the various attributes associated with witches, their connection to magic, their ability to transform, their perceived power to curse and control. All of these were seen as projections of those anxieties, playing out those fears and forbidden urges in a symbolic way.
Okay, so now we can't forget another important figure who initially followed in Freud's footsteps but ultimately forged his own path, Carl Jung. His ideas also had a major impact on the way we look at folklore, right?
Absolutely. While Jung disagreed with some of Freud's core ideas, particularly that heavy emphasis on sexuality, he was still deeply interested in symbolism and the unconscious. But instead of focusing on individual neuroses like Freud, Jung was looking for those universal threads that connect us all on a deeper level.
So what were Jung's key contributions? What set him apart from Freud?
Jung's most significant contribution was the concept of archetypes, those universal symbolic figures that he believed existed in all cultures. Like think of the hero, the trickster, the wise old man, the great mother. These archetypes, according to Jung, reflect the deepest, most shared human experiences, those fundamental patterns of thought and behavior that transcend individual cultures.
So if Freud was dissecting the individual psyche, Jung was searching for the universal language of the human soul. That's a pretty big difference.
Precisely. And he used folklore extensively to support his theories. In fact, one of his later works delved into the modern phenomenon of UFO sightings. He argued that these weren't necessarily about actual aliens, but reflected our collective desire to escape earthly limitations and anxieties. It's like the symbolic yearning for something beyond the mundane.
That's incredibly thought-provoking. So instead of focusing on extraterrestrial encounters, Jung saw UFO sightings as a manifestation of our collective desire for something more, something beyond our earthly existence.
Exactly. And just like with Freud, we can question whether Jung was accurately interpreting these phenomena or simply imposing his own perspective.
It seems we've only just dipped our toes into this fascinating and sometimes perplexing world of psychoanalytic interpretations of folklore. There's so much more to explore.
It really is like a rabbit hole. And we've only just started to explore this fascinating world of symbolism and archetypes. But before we get too deep into theory, let's think about what all this means for you, the listener. Why should we care about these psychoanalytic interpretations of folklore? What's the point?
That's a great question. It can't just be an intellectual exercise, can it? There has to be some, takeaway, some way to apply these insights to our own lives.
Absolutely. Think of it this way. Have you ever noticed how certain themes just pop up again and again in stories from all over the world? It's kind of weird, right?
Yeah, now that you mention it.
Well, psychoanalysis suggests that these aren't just random things.
Yeah.
These recurring patterns might be tapping into deeper, universal human experiences, those anxieties that we all share.
It's like a cultural echo chamber, with these stories bouncing back and forth across time and space, reflecting those shared anxieties and desires.
Exactly. And it's not just about recognizing those universal themes either. Psychoanalytic interpretations can also help us understand how different societies grapple with taboo subjects, those things they can't or won't talk about directly. Folklore can provide a safe space to explore these forbidden topics, expressing those anxieties and desires through the language of symbolism and metaphor.
It's like a cultural pressure valve, releasing those pent-up emotions through stories rather than letting them, build up and explode.
That's a great analogy. And it's not just about understanding those broader cultural anxieties either. Think about how you as an individual respond to these stories. What draws you to certain tales? What resonates with you? Why are some stories more unsettling than others? It might be your own unconscious speaking, those hidden parts of yourself, finding expression through the characters and symbols of these tales.
So it's not just about deciphering the cultural code of these stories, but also about understanding ourselves better through our own unique reactions to them.
Precisely. And that brings us back to the source material you shared. It mentioned that psychoanalytic interpretation can help us understand the hopes, aspirations, and psychological makeup of the people. It's like holding up a mirror to both the individual and the culture, revealing those hidden depths that we might not be, consciously aware of.
Okay, yeah, I see that. Now, to really see how these interpretations work in practice, let's revisit the work of those scholars we mentioned earlier, Ernest Jones and Erich Fromm. Their work provides some really thought-provoking examples of how psychoanalytic theory can be applied to specific folktales.
Let's start with Ernest Jones and his fascination with those creatures that lurk in the shadows of our collective imagination. Like witches, vampires, and all those things that make us sleep with the lights on.
Okay, I'm ready for a good scare. What was Jones's take on these figures?
Remember his extensive study on the nightmare. It's a deep dive into the world of medieval demons, vampires, werewolves, you name it, all those creatures that haunted people's dreams. Jones was particularly interested in how these monstrous figures represented repressed desires and anxieties. It's like he was a psychological detective trying to uncover those psychological fingerprints hidden within these stories.
So what were some of his key findings? What did he ozero out?
Let's take the witch as an example. Jones saw her as embodying a complex mix of anxieties, particularly those related to female power and sexuality. He argued that she represented women's fear and anger towards their mothers, their own sexuality, and the perceived threat they posed to those patriarchal power structures.
So the witch wasn't just a scary figure in a fairy tale, but a symbol of all those anxieties and tensions swirling beneath the surface of society.
Precisely. And those anxieties played out in the various attributes associated with witches, their connection to magic, their ability to transform, their perceived power to curse and control. These attributes were seen as projections of those anxieties, those fears, and forbidden urges finding expression in a symbolic form.
It's like society was projecting all of its fears and anxieties onto this figure of the witch, like creating a scapegoat for those things they couldn't confront directly.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder if those historical witch hunts were in part a way to channel those anxieties, to project them onto an external enemy rather than confronting the underlying social and psychological issues.
That's a really interesting thought. Now, Jones didn't just stop with witches, did he? He also explored the world of vampires. Those seductive creatures of the night who prey on the innocent have always held a certain fascination for us, you know? What did Jones make of their psychological significance?
He saw vampires as representing a kind of repressed oral sadism. Think about the classic vampire motifs, the piercing fangs, the blood drinking, the draining of life force. He interpreted these as symbolic expressions of aggressive impulses, particularly those related to early childhood development and that oral stage when babies explore the world through their mouths.
So the vampire is essentially a grown-up baby, still fixated on that primal urge to suck and bite.
In a way, yes. And Jones connected this back to the Oedipal complex, suggesting that the vampire's blood drinking also symbolized this forbidden desire for the mother's milk, like this regressive longing for that early state of nourishment and dependence.
Wow, that's a pretty intense interpretation. But it does make you think about the deeper psychological layers at play in these stories. It's not just about the literal act of blood drinking, but about the underlying psychological needs and desires it might represent.
Exactly. And Jones believed that these vampire figures embodied those taboo desires, playing out those forbidden impulses in a safe, symbolic space.
Okay, now let's shift gears a little bit and revisit Erich Fromm's work. Remember, he had a different perspective on the Oedipus complex, suggesting that it wasn't just about individual desires, but also about those larger societal struggles between patriarchal and matriarchal power structures.
Right, you're right. And he famously applied this then to the classic tale of Red Riding Hood.
Yes. It's such a familiar story. I'm curious to hear how Fromm interpreted it.
Fromm's interpretation challenges that traditional view of the story as like a simple cautionary tale about a naive girl being seduced by a wolf. He saw it as a representation of male anxieties about female power, particularly those anxieties surrounding sexuality and reproduction.
I'm all ears. How did he see that playing out in the story?
Well, he pointed to the wolf swallowing both the girl and the grandmother as representing a kind of pregnancy envy, that male fear of female reproductive power. And the punishment of the wolf was sterility, by filling its belly with stones. Fromm saw that as a way to symbolically neutralize that female power, to castrate the threat it posed to male dominance.
So it's not just about a wolf and a girl in the woods, but about those deeper cultural anxieties about the power of the feminine.
Exactly. And this interpretation highlights how folklore can reflect the anxieties and power dynamics of, a particular culture. It's not just about individual psychology, but about that broader social and historical context in which these stories are told and retold.
It's incredible how much depth and complexity can be packed into these seemingly simple tales, isn't it?
And that's what makes folklore so endlessly fascinating. It's a mirror reflecting our individual and collective psyches, our hopes, fears, and anxieties.
I love that a mural reflecting our psyches. It really captures the power of folklore. We've really gone deep on this stuff, haven't we? From Freud's ideas about symbolism to Jung's concept of archetypes. It's like we've just scratched the surface. But before we go, we should probably acknowledge that, well, not everyone agrees with these psychoanalytic interpretations of folklore, right?
Yeah, that's true. Like any theory, psychoanalysis has its limitations. Some critics argue that it focuses way too much on sexuality, reducing everything to some hidden Oedipal desire. And others think it's just way too speculative, reading meanings into these stories that, were never there in the first place.
So it's like we're trying to fit square pegs into round holes.
Yeah, you could say that. It's important to remember that these interpretations are just one way of looking at folklore. There are many other approaches, historical, anthropological, literary, and they all have their own unique perspectives. The important thing is to be aware of the strengths and limitations of each approach.
It's like having a toolbox full of different tools. You wouldn't use a hammer to tighten a screw, right? You
Yeah.
choose the best tool for the job.
Exactly. And when it comes to folklore, having a diverse set of tools lets us appreciate the richness and complexity of these stories from, multiple perspectives.
Our source material left us with this really interesting idea that these psychoanalytic interpretations can help us understand the hopes, aspirations, and psychological makeup of the people who created these stories.
Yeah, that's powerful, isn't it? It suggests that folklore isn't just a bunch of entertaining tales, but like a window into the hearts and minds of the people who created and shared them. These stories can show us so much about the cultures that produced them, the anxieties they faced, the desires they held, and the ways they made sense of the world around them.
Yeah, and it challenges us to look beyond the surface of these stories and think about those deeper layers of meaning, like what anxieties and desires might be expressed through those recurring symbols and metaphors, and how do those themes resonate with us, like today?
And maybe even more interesting is what our own personal responses to these stories say about us. Like, why are we drawn to certain tales? What makes them stick with us? And what might those reactions reveal about our own unconscious beliefs and motivations? That's something to think about.
It's like folklore is like a mirror reflecting back our individual and collective psyches. It's like a conversation across time and cultures that can help us understand not just the past, but ourselves in the present moment.
Exactly. And that's maybe the most valuable thing about these psychoanalytic interpretations. They remind us that these stories aren't just relics of the past, but these living, breathing expressions of the human experience that are still relevant today.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a challenge. Think about your favorite folktale or myth. What speaks to you? What makes it stick in your mind? And what might it reveal about you and the culture you come from?
It's an invitation to start a journey of self-discovery, using the wisdom of folklore as our guide. Who knows what we might find along the way?
Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep listening for the echoes of the human heart in the stories we tell and the stories we inherit.